No problem.
Great, we're all set.
Okay. Tihei Māori ora. Ko te mea tuatahi ngā mihi nui ki te tangata whenua o ēnei whenua. Tēnā koutou, ko te mea tuarua ngā mihi nui ki o tātou tūpuna. Haere, haere, haere. Ko te mea tuatoru ngā mihi nui ki tēnei whare. Tēnā koe. Ko te mea tuawha ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora anō, everyone. Hello again. I'm Amelia, as I said earlier, and really excited to be with you all today. I'm part of the Indo-Pacific Languages and Literatures Department, and one of the newest staff members there on faculty as the Māori Language Lecturer. So I'm excited to share more about my language, Te Reo Māori, and also my culture with you all today. The first thing I started off with was speaking in Te Reo Māori, the Māori language. And I started off with something that we often start our speeches, our whai kōrero with, and that is saying, Tihei Māori ora. And so for us as Māori, that is the breath of life, that is that life force or the life energy. And it's like when a baby is first born and the baby takes his or her first breath, it's bringing in that life essence or life force to what we're saying, and also acknowledging that Māori, the life essence that is within all of us. So I started off saying that. Then following that I talked about, I acknowledged the tangata whenua, so the indigenous peoples of the lands we're on. So I'm here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm actually here on my own ancestral homeland, which is the land of the Ngāti Wai. So Ngāti Wai is one of my tribes. So, acknowledging my people, we're on our land, but I also wanted to acknowledge, the indigenous Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli, our indigenous Hawaiian cousins, over there, as that's the lands that, most of you are on today. And so as an Indigenous woman and as a, person who is sharing my Indigenous language and culture abroad, it's important for us to, acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands we're on, especially when we're connecting to these Indigenous languages and cultures. And acknowledging our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm actually, as I said, currently in New Zealand, but I'm actually based in Los Angeles. And I run a traditional Māori performing group there, Ngā Anahera Māori. I also have a language school, and I teach Te Reo Māori to learners living abroad. So a lot of my students live in the US and the UK and Europe, in Australia and parts of Asia and also the Middle East. So, something I'm really passionate about is making, my culture accessible for those who are living outside of Aotearoa, New Zealand. All right, so then the next thing I acknowledged was all of our ancestors. So as Māori, we believe that our ancestors are watching us, that they're guiding us and protecting us. So acknowledging everyone who's passed on, people that we didn't even know their names, people who, we may have known or who may have recently passed on. So acknowledging them all as being here in this space with us. Thirdly, I acknowledge this whare, this house. And these days it's looking very different because we're all on Zoom a lot. So acknowledging Zoom as being our gathering place. Zoom is providing us with the platform for all of us to meet and connect today. Also interestingly about that word whare, it is used throughout the Pacific Islands, whare or whale. There's a lot of different variations. So you start to see these patterns within our Pacific Island cultures and nations with these words, that they all coming, all being in the same family, and, the Austronesian language family. Right, and then lastly, I acknowledge all of you here. So ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you all for joining me today. A special thanks to you, Blaine, for having me here to share about Te Reo Māori with you all today. All right, so I have something to screen share. Would you be able to give me that, I think, permission? What we're going to do is I'll pop over to my presentation. So What I'll be talking about today is indigenizing your mind. And so, I think, in the world today, we're in a, certain space in terms of our evolution as humans. And so there's a lot of conversations going on about things like decolonization, moving towards different ways of decolonizing from, this colonial state or this Western culture that many of us grow up in. I like to kind of flip this a little, and instead of talking about decolonization, I like to talk about re-indigenization, because when we're talking about re-indigenization, we're actually centering us as Indigenous people, whereas decolonization, we're still centering the colonizer there. So I like to use this word re-indigenization. And so that's where I've got this word from, which is indigenize your mind. So, moving our minds more towards an Indigenous perspective and really taking on board these Indigenous ways of thinking that, when we've grown up in this Western cultural context, we might not automatically think of. Right? So indigenize your mind. And then another element about our re-indigenization, about using that word, is because it actually gives us somewhere to go towards. So if we're re-indigenizing or indigenizing our mind, we're moving towards an Indigenous culture's norms. And a lot of these norms and practices have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been tried and tested. And so, in terms of re-indigenization, we're moving towards, an Indigenous culture, all of us having these very basic similarities at the root of our cultures, versus when we talk about decolonization, we don't necessarily have anywhere to move towards, because then if we're moving towards decolonization, we're ending up, where are we really ending up? Because there's nothing really for us to go towards. We're taking something away, so decolonization, but then we're not sure where we are. Whereas re-indigenization gives us some place to stand, somewhere to move towards, and has us, end up in a place which has been around for centuries, in terms of the Indigenous peoples on this planet. All right, so so we'll be talking about this today, indigenizing your mind, and specifically through the vehicle of Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, because, obviously that's what I teach, but also it's a different way that we can connect. And while, we all have those similarities as Indigenous peoples, there are also some unique similarities that are specific to Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, and Te Reo Māori. All right, so I put in this little slideshow, this little slide here with a few pictures, just because I am relatively new to the university. So as well as teaching Te Reo Māori to learners living abroad, I also teach haka workshops, haka being our traditional Māori war dance or war challenge. I'm teaching here one of the most well-known haka, which is called the Kamate haka. It was made famous by our All Blacks, our national rugby team. They perform it in front of the opposing team. They do a haka at the beginning of every single one of their games. So this is me. I'm teaching here at a Polynesian dance school in Southern California. And then this middle picture is me performing at the Pacific Island Festival in San Diego, California, which is something that my group does. Before COVID, we did that every year, and it's always great to connect with other performers and dancers, from our Pacific Island region. And then lastly, this is my kapahaka group, Ngā Anahera Māori, performing at a Māori exhibition. It was a photography exhibition that was in Los Angeles. So ko wai au, who am I? So this is, part of who I am, and ko Amelia aho, I am Amelia. All right, so in my culture, we start anything of significance with a karakia. So a karakia is a prayer or an incantation of nature. And this specific karakia that I've chosen to start our session with today connects us back to two of our atua, or two of our god or goddesses, and that this is our atua, which connect us back to our creation story, which is Rangi Nui, who is our sky father, and Papa Tuanuku, who is our earth mother. And so from a te ao Māori, from a Māori perspective, you know, the world came into existence through the separation of our sky father, Rangi Nui, and our earth mother, Papa Tuanuku. And it was actually one of their sons, Tāne Mahuta, who is the god of the forest, who pushed them apart. So initially they existed in a tight embrace, and their many children lived in darkness, but they came up with a plan to separate their parents because one of the children saw a glimpse of light, and so they separated their parents, leading and creating the world we are in today, where we have the sky above and the earth below. And so as Māori, when it rains, when it rains, that is Rangi Nui, the sky father, crying for his wife, Papa Tuanuku, the earth mother. And then when Papa Tuanuku, when her mists rise, that's her reaching out to the sky father, Rangi Nui. All right, and this karakia talks about that. So just a little bit of background there with this karakia. All right, so I'd love you to join me now with this karakia. You know, feel free to kind of sit there in a relaxed position and kind of just listen to these words. You know, a big part of our te reo Māori, our Māori language, is that it does have a spiritual element, and there is a certain wairua or spirit that comes with these words. The words also have mana, power, prestige, and authority. And I really just want you to, you know, listen to the words, but also experience the words and, you know, experience them on a more wairua based, more spiritual level. All right, so here we are. This is our karakia timatanga, our beginning karakia. Ko te reo o ngā manu tērā, ka tangi nei i te ao. Kua uru ko te rā ki wānga nui, ia rangi nui, ia Papa Tuanuku. Ka noho ko rangi nui ki runga, ko Papa Tuanuku ki raro. Ka heke iho ko ngā roi mata ia rangi nui. Ka hiki ake ko te kohu ia Papa Tuanuku. Ko te tohu tērā. Ka ora tawa i te ao, i te pō. Tūturu whakamaua kia tina, tina, huie, tai ki ye. All right, and the English translation is, there is the voice of birds heralding daylight as the sun enters between the sky father and the earth mother, sky father above, earth mother below. Rangi's tears fall, Papa's mist rises, thus being the sign that we shall live in light and darkness. This is my commitment to them, gather, unite. All right, and so already in this karakia, there's a lot of elements there. You know, it's very rich with our te ao Māori, our Māori worldview, you know, when we're connecting to the sky, rangi nui to the earth, Papa Tuanuku, and even connecting to the birds as they herald the daylight, the sun, tama nui te rā, it's the name of our sun, even how it says, ka ora tawa i te ao i te pō, that we shall live in light and darkness. And so, you know, I think this is also noteworthy because in the Western culture, we do tend to want to kind of put on a front like, oh, you know, how are you? I'm good. How are you? Good. You know, there's not that space for, you know, the light and the darkness. Whereas, you know, in an Indigenous culture and in our culture, we acknowledge both. We're acknowledging, you know, the light as well as the darkness. So te ao I te pō. All right. Okay. And so this manu here, this bird, this is called, in my area, we call this pi waka waka, but it's called many names. It's also called ti rairaka, ti wai waka, pi wai waka. So we have depending on where you're from in New Zealand, we have different names for these birds. And, you know, as Māori, we do also believe that these manu, these birds are messengers, and sometimes they can bring messages from our tupuna, our ancestors, And also they can also be a tohu, a sign for certain things. So that is something, we connect with, the birds and other different elements. Here where I'm from, Ngāti Wai, we have an albatross, a tukaiaia. The albatross is actually our kaitiaki, which is our guardian or our spiritual guardian that, watches over this area. In my tribe, being Ngāti Wai, which translates as people of the water. So as well as this manu, this bird, as our kaitiaki, we also have a wheke, which is an octopus. And we also have a whai, which is a stingray. And so that's connecting us to the water elements. And so these are our kaitiaki, our guardians, or our spiritual guardians of our area here in Ngāti Wai. All right, so today we are going to be looking at what is a pēpeha. And a pēpeha is how we identify ourselves in Te Ao Māori. So it's based on how we connect to our mountain, our body of water, our canoe, our tribe, sub-tribe, marae, ancestors and family. And so our marae is our traditional meeting place. So marae are where, all of us Māori, we have different marae that we connect to based on, our whakapapa, our family genealogy. Right? And so why is a pēpeha important? It's important because our relationships or our whanaungatanga to Te Ao Māori, nature, our ancestors, our family and each other are fundamental elements in Te Ao Māori. So in our culture is based upon a matrix known as whakapapa. And so that translates loosely as family genealogy. But from our family genealogy, we connect to, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, and so on and so forth, our ancestors, all the way back to the creation of the first human, Hene Ahuone, by Tane Mahuta, the god of the forest, all the way back to the beginning of the universe, which was Rangi and Papa Tuanuku, their embrace, and they were then separated, our Sky Father and Earth Mother. And then our whakapapa also exists forward as well. So we have Ngā Uri, our descendants, who are, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So this expansive way of thinking plays a big role in our connections to our whānau, our families, nature, ancestors, and, all these different elements that make up our culture. All right, so our pēpeha, is based in whakapapa. And so we whakapapa back to a waka or a canoe. And this waka was the canoe that our ancestors came on to Aotearoa from our ancient homeland, Hawaii, which we, now find out that's from other islands in the Pacific, like Hawaii, Rarotonga, and different islands in this Pacific Island region. And we also whakapapa back to a body of water, a river, a part of the ocean, a mountain. And we also have our sub-tribe, our tribe, and our marae. So this is my pēpeha, and I'm going to share that with you now. And then we are also going to have a go at creating our own pēpeha based on our own whakapapa. All right, so here is my pēpeha. Ko hurua ki te maunga, ko punara ki te awa, ko mā tātua te waka, ko te uri o hiki hiki te hapu, ko Ngāti Wai te iwi, ko mōkau o whangaruru te marae, ko Amelia Butler aho. So Huruwiki is my mountain, Punaraku is my river. Mā tātua is the canoe. Te uri o hiki hiki is my sub-tribe. Ngāti Wai is my tribe. And Mōkau, which is here in Whangaruru, is my gathering place, and I'm Amelia. So I've popped in there just a picture of my maunga. So this is Huruwiki. It looks out towards the Moana, and we're here in a region called the Bay of Islands. So, a lot of different islands in this region, small islands that make up this part of the far north. And so for those who are familiar with New Zealand, we're about 1 hour north of Whangarei, which is the closest city. All right, so now we're going to have a go at creating our own pākehā. And so, we're going to start now thinking in a more indigenous way. And so I want you to think, what mountain do you connect to? Right. So if you are, indigenous, that could be, your indigenous mountain, the mountain that, you connect to through your tribal affiliations. But if you don't identify it as indigenous, it could be, the mountain next to your house where you grew up, or it could be, the mountain that you go hiking on every day. So have a think about what mountain you connect to, and then same with the body of water. So this could be, river, sea. What is the body of water you connect with? If you're from another country, it could be a body of water there, or it could be a body of water where you currently live. Lastly, where is your gathering place, or what is your gathering place? So that could be, that could be, for those of you who maybe go to church or, practice yoga, it could be your whare karakia, your church. It could be your yoga studio or dance studio if you're in a halal group. So have a think about what's your gathering place. And then I do have, who are the indigenous people of the land you live on? So, I think mostly everyone is probably there at Manoa. So that would be the Kanaka Māori. That there might be another name that you use there. So we're going to think about that. And then, I'd love to have a few people share what they came up with. You're also welcome to chat what you came up, put what you came up with in the chat box for those who might be unable to share. All right, so it's the 4 elements there. It's a mountain, body of water, your gathering place, and also the indigenous people of the land you live on, which, however you want to refer to them. All right, so would anyone like to share those elements, those 4 things? And that's okay if no one wants to share. You could also just type it in the chat box if you want to do that as well. Right, would anyone like to have a go at or share with everyone what they connected with in terms of their mountain, body of water, gathering place, and the indigenous people?
Amelia, I have a question actually.
Sure. Yeah.
So, not everyone lives close to a mountain. I think most people are close to some kind of water source because you need it to survive. And there may be gathering places. And of course, there would be indigenous people in almost any land, anywhere that is colonized now or has been colonized. But mountains are not necessarily everywhere. New Zealand is very mountainous. I know, I've been there. It's beautiful, beautiful country and very mountainous. But there are places, parts of the world where it's really quite flat, like the prairies in North America, for instance. And you can go a long way without seeing a mountain in some parts of the country.
Yes, I totally agree. I often have students in the classes that I run. My business is Learn Māori Abroad, so these are separate from the university, but often students do come from a place where there's no mountains at all. So in that case, they would use, for example, like some sort of landmark, and it could even be like a man-made landmark. Like it doesn't have to necessarily be like a natural landmark. So it could be a landmark, even like a statue. It could be, the prairies. It could be a desert, a valley, anything that they felt like a connection to, and, often I've had people who've taken my haka classes and, they'll share, Mount Fuji in Japan as their mountain, even though they've never been there, they've never stepped foot in Japan, but they feel a sort of spiritual connection towards that mountain. So it's even thinking of it like that, like what mountain do you feel connected with? And maybe you haven't even been there, or you've only seen a photo of this mountain, but there's just this there's this connection with that particular mountain. So, and if not a mountain, then it can be an other element, man-made or otherwise. And if not, I've also had students who have just skipped that one completely because they come from a very flat place in the States, and there's just no mountains for miles where they live. So that's also okay. So this is just a very shortened version of what I usually work with my students on. So if there's not a mountain that you feel like a connection with, then that is totally fine as well. You can always skip that one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. All right. So I see we've got a couple of messages here. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so Gary, thank you for sharing. And Emma has a question. How do people who aren't quite sure which land they most connect with or connect to multiple homes now do this? That is a great question. So for me, for example, I actually have 3 tribes, but for the purposes of presentation and also time limitations, I've just said in the previous slide, ko Ngāti Wai te iwi, but I actually have 3 iwi. So I usually say, ko Ngāti Wai, ko ngā puhi, ko Ngāti Awa, ngā iwi. So for those, often there are people who do have more than one mountain, or do have more body of water, or do have more than one place that they call home, and you can incorporate them all. For me, my mother is Māori and my dad is Pākehā, which is, his ancestors are from Scotland and Ireland. But often those who have 2 Māori parents, they would have 2 mountains, 2 bodies of water, multiple tribes. So it's totally fine as well to list them all, because it's part of, it's part of who you are, part of who you identify as. All right, so on this next slide, I have got in the translation. So ko X te maunga, so X is the mountain, or X being, whatever that is for you. And then it could be, maybe you're not doing a mountain, or maybe you're missing that one out. That's also fine. And then I've got ko wai te awa, or moana. So, moana, being a very commonly used term there across the Pacific Islands for our sea, our ocean. Then awa being river. So wai is the river or sea. So you can choose one, or you could do a line for both. Then we have Z, ko Z te wahi hui. Z is the gathering place. So wahi is our word for place. Then hui is our word for a meeting or a gathering. And so the reason I put te wahi hui here is because the marae is a uniquely Māori gathering place. So my Māori students will use marae and find out their marae. But my other students, wahi hui as in gathering place. So it's a place that you're gathering at versus an actual marae. All right, and then this next one called B te iwi. So B is the tribe, peoples, nation. So this word here, iwi, it translates as all 3 of these words. So, it could be used to mean tribe. It's also, peoples and then nation. So it has those different translations. And then ko A te iwi o te wahi e noho nei au. So A is the tribe of the place where I live. So I just added that one as well, so we can, wherever we are, acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands where we're currently living. Okay. All right. So does anyone have any questions specifically about pepeha, or, any questions relating to your specific pepeha, or how you would put that together? Check the... Okay, ka pai. So we will go on. All right. So here I've got some questions that are related to your pēpeha. And, the first thing I wanted to touch about was our use of the words here. We use ko wai. So here we're saying ko wai tō maunga. And what we're actually saying is, who is your mountain? Because from a te Ao Māori perspective and from an indigenous perspective, we relate to things like mountains and rivers just as we would people. And in fact, a few years ago, one of our rivers here in New Zealand, was able to claim the legal rights of a person. So that was a big victory for us as Māori in terms of our culture being embraced within the New Zealand legal system, and to have this river, because it's sacred to us as Māori, have this river be acknowledged, and not only acknowledged, but literally given the same rights as a person. And so, that was not only a victory for us as Māori, but, for all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, in terms of, the legalities that surround what is a person and, what is not a person. So, as Indigenous people, we do connect with our rivers, our mountains, our forests, our oceans, just as we would our friends or our family, right? And so in juxtaposition or in contrast to the Western culture, man is above nature, or man is separate from nature. And so, think of this, we have man, at the top of everything, and then nature and animals and everything else is below man or humans. Whereas from that indigenous mindset, us as humans, us as people, we are living in connection with nature. We are one with nature, and we don't put ourselves on this hierarchy as done in the Western culture against nature. So in the West, we're seeing ourselves as separate from nature, and things we might do don't have an impact. Whereas as an indigenous culture, everything we do has an impact, and, we remain connected to and one with nature. All right. So that brings us back to our language usage here. So here you can see ko wai tō maunga, who is your mountain? It's actually translated into English as what is your mountain, because, based on the Ao Pākehā, the Western worldview, and also English grammar rules, we wouldn't say who is your mountain, because in the Western world, we don't personify mountains. Another element of mountains for us as Māori is that many Māori see mountains as our ancestors. And we have different stories about mountains, two mountains meeting each other, two mountains falling in love and then separating. And that gives us the reason why the mountains are placed where they are, and why they are where they are on the land. And so, a lot of our stories are based around explaining why natural phenomena is how it is, why it is like that. We have a story about the sun and Maui slowing the sun, and because the sun used to move very fast over the sky, and Maui slowed it down with his brothers, and now it moves slowly across the sky, giving us time to eat our food, to, harvest crops, to work on our gardens. And so a lot of times these stories are explaining these natural phenomena. But what you can see right here with the mountains is that what is your mountain, using that word what instead of who, creates that automatic segregation. It's an automatic separation that we then have from our maunga, our mountain, because now we're relating to the mountain as separate from us. We're relating to it as a thing. It's now become a what. All right. So in English, again, because of our Western worldview and the English language, we do translate it as what is your mountain, but more accurately from the Ao Māori mindset, it would be who is your mountain. All right. So as I've said here, this reflects the differences between the Māori worldview, te Ao Māori, and the Western worldview, te Ao Pākehā. So, if someone was to ask me, who is like someone wanted to know who my mother was, they would ask the same question, exactly the same question, but instead of saying maunga, they would use the word for mother, which is mama. So they would say, oh, ko wai tō mama, who is your mother? Or, for example, ko wai tō pāpā, who is your father? Ko wai tō hoa rangatira, who is your spouse? All right, so as you can see, there's the differences there that we have in a Western worldview. We don't have them in te Ao Māori. And so we're using ko wai tō maunga, just like I would ask ko wai tō mama, who is your mountain, who is your mother? All right, and so then the next element here is asking no hea koe. So we've looked at ko wai tō maunga, asking who is your mountain. Now we're going to look at no hea koe. And so this is another element of an indigenous mindset. So from a Māori perspective, no hea koe is the most important question, right? So this word koe there, that is the word for you, for one person. This word here, it's translating as where, and then the no here at the beginning is translating as from. But that word no, it's actually a lot deeper than just where you're from. We're actually asking to whom do you belong? So no goes towards belonging, right? So for example, if I was saying, oh, that's my car, I would also use one of these N possessives. So if someone was like, no wai tērā motu car, whose car is that? Or to whom does this car belong? I would say, nōku tērā motu car. So that car belongs to me. That's my car. All right. So just taking a look at, not only do we connect in a significant way to where we're from, but it's more than that, it's actually where we belong. So, no hea koe, where are you from? Which is how it translates in English, but we're asking for your belonging place. Where do you belong? And that also touches upon our relationship as Māori with the land, with whenua. So whenua, our land, we identify through these different elements like our mountains and rivers, but also identifying through the land. And that word whenua, it's the same word we use whenua for land. We also use whenua for placenta. So, when a baby is in utero, in the womb, they are nurtured by the whenua, by the placenta of the mother. Then once they are born, they are nurtured by the whenua, which is by the land. And so again, you can see these, these really strong connections that we have with the land and, with us as people. All right. So going back to this question, where are you from? So this is the most important question, because by establishing where someone is from, we can establish our whanaungatanga, or our relationship with that person. So for example, if we were seeing two of our elders meet in a Māori cultural context, the first thing they would say would be, no hea koe. Where are you from? And from, sharing, where you're from, or, no Ngāti Wai aho, I'm from Ngāti Wai, which is my tribe. That's how we can start to establish our relationship with this person. Because again, everything is existing on this matrix of whakapapa, family genealogy, and we're connecting to each other by way of this question. All right. So while no hea koe is the most important question from a Māori perspective, we of course also have ko wai tō ingoa, which means what is your name? And I know this is very similar to how to say it in the Hawaiian language too. So ko wai tō ingoa, excuse me, what is your name? All right. But as I said before, so, usually when we're first meeting someone, we'd say, hi, how are you? Or hi, my name's Amelia. What's your name? Whereas from a Māori perspective, we would say, kia ora, nō hea koe. And again, it's connecting us back to not only where we're from, where that person is from, and finding that connection with that person, but it's also connects us back to the land, to where we belong, to our whenua and our connection there as Māori. All right. So nō hea koe, for me, I say nō whangaruru ahau. I am from Whangaruru. In the context of, teaching Māori to learners who live abroad, I say, nō Aotearoa ahau, Aotearoa being our Māori name for New Zealand. So Aotearoa translates as land of the long white cloud. So again, it just depends on, the cultural context or, the context that I'm in. If I'm talking to someone who is Māori, often I will say, my tribe or the specific area where my whānau is from. But if I'm teaching, those who are living overseas, I will say, no Aotearoa ahau, I'm from New Zealand. All right, so that's something also, having a teaching moment here, that's something you could also share. So nō hea koe, and then to respond back to that person, you would say nō, and then insert wherever you're from, and then use ahau, which is the word for I or me. So I'll pop that in the, so nō hea koe is where are you from? Nor, you're going to put wherever it is you're from, and ahau. All right. I am from X. Okay. So for those of you who would like to share, you're welcome to share, in the chat, where are you from? Nō hea koe, using that little sentence structure I've given you there. All right. And then lastly, the ko waito ingoa, what is your name? So ko Amelia ahau, I'm Amelia. Ko Amelia o, which is also I am Amelia. Or we could also say ko Amelia tōku ingoa. All right. So 3 possible ways to answer this one. Either saying, I am Amelia, or Amelia is my name. This tōku here, that's the word for my. Ingoa being our word for name, and I know this is very similar to the Hawaiian language, also to the Tahitian language in terms of similarities. It's Cook Island Māori, Tahitian, and Hawaiian that are the most similar to Te Reo Māori. All right, so if you've learned any of those languages, you'll definitely see the familiarities with our reo, with our languages there. Okay. All right. And so that's another one you can try out. So, ko waito ingoa, what is your name? Ko, you're going to insert your name there. Ahau. Or you could also use o or tōku ingoa. So as I said earlier on, so I'm from here up north, and all of our tribes, we have different dialectal differences. So for instance, my friend who's from Taranaki, he wouldn't say whenua, he would actually say wenua. So he drops the H whenever there's an H and a W and an H. I'll pop this in the chat so for those who want to get a visual. So instead of saying whenua for land, he would say wenua. All right. And this is a dialectal difference. So depending on what tribe you come from and what area of New Zealand you're in, we have, different ways of saying things. So I'm from up north and we use ahau. So I say ko Amelia ahau. So that's what's more commonly used in this area. But, for all of you, it's up to you which one you want to use. You can use ahau, o, or tōku ingoa. All right. And then just like, British English, American English, New Zealand English, all of us Māori, we understand what each other are saying. just like I would understand someone speaking British English or American English, but there are those differences in, vocabulary and also how things are said. Another example is one of our South Island tribes called Ngai Tahu. They don't use an NG. So they're called Ngai Tahu, but they refer to themselves as Kai Tahu. So instead of using this NG, they replace that with a K. So, so if someone's, so I know if someone's, they're using, so for example, this word, ingoa, if they said ikoa, instead, I would know, okay, they're from Ngai Tahu. And again, they call themselves Kai Tahu because they're replacing the nga with the ke. All right, so it's really awesome seeing all these dialectal differences, but also knowing that we still understand each other. And then, me being from up north, I tend to use the kind of te reo Māori that we do use here in the north, although as a Māori teacher, I teach the more generic te reo Māori. But when I'm talking, for example, to my uncle or to my family, I'd be using, what we usually would use here up north, the dialect that we use. All right, well, I did want to open it up now to some Q&A, to some questions. I'm going to stop that screen share for now so I can see everyone. So I know I've gotten a few messages here on the chat. Does anyone have any questions either about, Pākehā that we've looked at, or these differences between Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, and Te Ao Pākehā, the westernized worldview, or anything in general about the Māori language and culture?
Hi, Amelia. Thank you very much. This is a really interesting talk. I do have a question for you. So I was really struck in the beginning by the way that you framed indigenizing one's mindset as having a more concrete goal to move towards rather than something a little more amorphous like decolonization. So I was wondering, in your teaching of Te Reo Māori, how does that concept of indigenizing the mindset of the students inform your pedagogical approach to the language?
That's a really great question, Greg. Ngā mihi, thanks for asking that. So, I think the first thing for me with my students that I teach is, firstly acknowledging and recognizing that most of us have grown up in this colonial context, in this Western culture. And, in terms of the history of us as Māori and the history of our language, we do have a history where our language was almost wiped out. And my grandmother was in that generation that was beaten at school for speaking in Te Reo Māori. And as a result, my grandmother grew up not speaking in Te Reo Māori. She didn't raise my mother in speaking Te Reo Māori. And my nana never spoke to me in Māori. And so, now we're seeing this huge movement towards revitalization of our language, and, a lot of people now learning Māori. But I think the first thing is to acknowledge is that, mostly all of my students are coming to this from a westernized worldview and a westernized mindset, because in a way it's water to the fish, and New Zealand has come a long way in terms of biculturalism, but there's still a very long way to come in terms of, having a true partnership between, Pākehā and Māori. And so I think, the first thing that I do is just, meet my students where they're at, because I do also have students who are not Māori, they're also not Kiwis, they're not New Zealanders. So they might just be, they might be American or, from Europe, and they just love the haka, or they love rugby, or they just love, the Polynesian culture. I've had students who are in Hawaiian halau wanting to learn Māori. And so it's a big variety of students that I do work with. And so, so a lot of times it's kind of introducing these concepts, in a way that they can understand, but also not in a way that's kind of overwhelming for them, because, most of the time they are, you know, we're swimming in it, the Western culture. So kind of like inch by inch, little by little, it's introducing them to this idea that, you know, you can connect with a mountain. As easy as that might sound, or as, you know, basic as that might sound, you know. And I know, you know, with everyone here living in Hawaii, it's not such a foreign concept, but to some of my students who are based on the mainland, on Turtle Island, you know, it's a new kind of concept. And so, you know, just kind of introducing these topics in this way of thinking very slowly, but also in a way that's more, you know, kind of like presenting the material as it is, versus like, so like in terms of my students, I don't think I always highlight the idea of like, oh, and this is a shift in mindset from a colonial mindset to an indigenous mindset. I won't always highlight that. I'll just be like, here's the material, you know, and then they kind of take it as part of, you know, learning the Māori language and learning about the Māori culture. And then, you know, when I am working on the Pākehā with my students, you know, that is really kind of an opportunity for me to really have them think about things differently. So, you know, for example, you know, there's people here in New Zealand and they identify as New Zealanders or Kiwis. And so they, you know, they're like, oh, I'm a New Zealander, I'm a Kiwi, just like in America. You know, I'm American. And so then I challenge them to go and find out, like, yes, you are a New Zealander, and, you know, where did your ancestors come from? What country did your ancestors come from? What was the name of the ship your ancestors came from England or Ireland to New Zealand? And, you know, my father, he's 80 years old, and he's learning how to speak Māori. And, you know, he found out that, so which is also part of my whakapapa, his ancestors came from Ireland on the SS Inverness to Aotearoa New Zealand. And so he's, you know, 5th or 6th generation New Zealander. And so, yeah, it's these little things like that. And, you know, I do get students who do say like, oh, but I've never been to Ireland. I don't feel connected to Ireland or England or Wales, wherever their ancestors are from, you know. And I try to explain to them, you know, like, acknowledge, yes, you know, there's not, you might not feel like you're connected, but from a Māori perspective, because we base everything on whakapapa, that is part of your whakapapa, you know, whether you connect to it or not, whether you feel like you're connected to it or not, it's actually got nothing to do with how you feel. It's more about that as your whakapapa. And you wouldn't be here if, you know, this person and this person didn't meet and they had a child, and then that child grew up and met someone else and had a child, and so on and so forth. And here we all are today. And so, you know, we are the living, breathing faces of our ancestors. And, you know, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for our ancestors coming, sailing on a ship, or maybe in modern times it was an airplane. But, you know, I find that, you know, once they kind of start to sit with that idea of, you know, basing it in their whakapapa versus how they feel about England or Ireland, where they're originally from, they start to kind of see, okay, I understand. And so that's slowly shifting their perspective. One of my American students was actually able to find out that her ancestors came on the well-known pilgrimage ship, the Mayflower, I think it is. And she was able to connect right back to her ancestors coming on that ship. And so it's really amazing. And it ends up being a very enriching experience for my students to actually find out more about, well, you know, where am I from? Where are my ancestors from? Because they do think, you know, a lot of Americans in general, they don't know, you know, who they are or where they're from. And as Māori, we're very strong in knowing, you know, who we are and where we're from, based on our whakapapa. So yeah, it's always interesting to work with that, but, you know, ultimately they do, you know, once they kind of sit with it, they do start to understand, you know, it's not about so much who I feel connected, it's about this is where your ancestors are from. So, that is, no Airani or Kutupuna. My ancestors are from Ireland, and which is something I can say as well as a Māori woman, because my dad is from Ireland originally, his ancestors. Anyway, Greg, I hope that answered your question.
It does, yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
I do have a follow-up question, but I want to give opportunity to other folks to ask questions first if they have any.
Yeah.
So I have a comment, actually. I am impressed with, the details are different, of course, from one culture to the next, but I'm impressed with how similar indigenous views are around the world, actually, in terms of the close connection with the land. This is something you see again and again and again, because the land gives you life. It provides the food for you to live, and the connection with the ancestors, of course, as well. And the position of man in nature as being a little creature in a vast creation is something I think indigenous people appreciate. That's the reality, of course, but I think indigenous people appreciate that much more than many Westerners do, who've adopted a kind of arrogant attitude about how much we can do in conquering nature. And I think we're beginning to see some of the consequences of that now with the condition of our planet, for example. You can only go so far outside of nature without doing damage. We are living in nature, really. And so I see that again and again with indigenous people. There's a wisdom there that Westerners need to learn.
Oh, ngā mihi, Robert. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Yeah, no, well said. One thing that I forgot to mention is, the idea of saying, ko wai tō ingoa, what is your name? It's a very individualistic idea. So, as Māori and as Indigenous people, our culture is focused on the collective, on the community versus the individual. And so, that's why if you were seeing the two elders meet, they would say, where are you from? Not what is your name? Because when you're saying, what is your name? You're automatically shrinking everything down to you as an individual. But as Māori, we actually don't refer to ourselves as an individual. In fact, when I'm with my Māori friends, they actually will refer to me as Ngāti Wai. Like if I tell a joke and they'll be like, aha, good one, Ngāti Wai, they'll call me by my tribal name. And that just goes to reflect, that's just reflective of our thinking, where we as an individual are not the most important thing. We actually also saw that, and so I'm glad you mentioned this, Robert. We saw that here actually in my pēpeha, where as you can see, my name is the very last thing I say. All right. So this is in whakapapa order. So we've got our mountain first, because mountains were here long before humans walked this earth. So mountain, and then our rivers, of course, were here before humans. Then we have our canoe, which brought us as Māori to Aotearoa. Then we have our sub-tribe, which is named after our ancestor, Te Uri o Hiki Hiki. And then we have our tribe. So our tribe is a collection of sub-tribes. And then the sub-tribe is a collection of whānau groups or family groups. And our word whānau, it's better translated as extended family, because it's an expansive concept of family. It's not just the nuclear family, it's our aunties, our uncles, our cousins, it's, third cousins, fourth cousins, it's all of our whānau extended family. And then I've got my marae there, which the marae is built as a whare, it's a meeting house, and then last is me, because again, I am not the most important thing. We're coming at our culture, and many Indigenous cultures are coming at it where we're coming from a bird's eye view, where when, like you rightfully said, and well said, Robert, you just really one speck of this, overall view in terms of, for example, my pēpeha, because, it's really great when other students share their pēpeha. If they've got the same mountain as me, or the same waka, or the same tribe, I know straight away we're related. you know? And so, you know, we're really existing as this really tiny speck on this whole matrix, because our pēpeha, it's alive now in the present, but it also exists in the past and the future. So my kids have the same pēpeha as I have. And of course, on their dad's side, we'd, you know, add that in too. And then their kids and their, you know, kids and so on and so forth. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Robert. It is a very different way of looking at the world. But in that sense, for us as Māori, it's very empowering because we do feel that power in the present. To, you know, walk boldly forward into the future. And from our perspective of time, we're walking backwards into the future because we can see everything that's happened in the past. We can't see the future, but we're walking backwards into it. And so yeah, so it's a expansive view, and that is why in our thinking as Indigenous people, you often see it's the Indigenous people who are the first to start protesting against, you know, these things that are really having a detrimental effect on the environment, and, you know, things like global warming or climate change, because they are seeing it from a matrix of whakapapa, and they're seeing it at least 7 generations into the future. And so that's why it's often the Indigenous people kind of holding it down for the environment, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anybody has any?
I have a question. What you've explained to us obviously has a spiritual aspect to it, and it also has a explanatory aspect in that it explains the origin of things. Do you or any of your students ever feel a conflict between that and what they've been taught as Christians? Because I'm assuming that a lot of Maori are Christian.
Yes. So, you know, in terms of Christianity, you know, when the British first came to New Zealand, you know, shortly after they arrived came missionaries, you know, preaching the gospel. And so there is a very strong Christian influence for Māori. So my grandmother was actually a Mormon. And so there is a big, you know, strong Christian influence in our culture. And so, you know, part of the reason I think that is because you know, the teachings of the gospel and the Bible, they line up so well with our own spiritual teachings and spiritual beliefs. And a lot of times what Māori did is they would adapt the teachings of, you know, Jesus Christ, but they'd also adapt the idea of that we have many atua, many gods and goddesses, you know, of the ocean, like Tangaroa and Hine Moana Nui, god and goddess of the ocean, or Tane Mahuta, god of the forest, and, you know, many other atua. And so, you know, in a way, I haven't really come across conflicts because I think because of the spiritual aspect, and, you know, Māori are a very spiritually connected people, that there hasn't really been any conflicts. And in fact, yeah, a lot of Māori are Christian, and yeah, and that's why I think that they do gravitate towards Christianity, because there's those similarities spiritually from our own spirituality. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, ngā mihi. Thanks, Ken.
Well, sadly, it seems like we're quickly running out of time. I'll leave the room open for a few minutes longer, but I just wanted to say thank you again for coming to speak. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everybody here has. This is huge turnout for the Austronesian Circle. I'm very happy that everybody was able to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Oh, ngā mihi nui. Thanks so much, Blaine. Thanks for having me. I'm going to close us off with a karakia whakamatunga, and then I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes if anyone does have any additional questions, or, you know, wants to ask anything in a smaller group. All right. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki, a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, ake, amene. All right, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you all so much. I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes just in case anyone does have questions. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Kia ora.
Kia ora.